coming close to running out of time. So I do want to let people know, I'm sure we could have continued talking for 45 more minutes, but I do want to give some time to our audience who I'm sure have some questions based upon what we have been talking about. So I am going to open the chat up. It is enabled, and I'm going to invite Susanna and Marianne to come back on camera with us. I will be taking a look at the chat for questions, but the first question, I did want to ask one final question to you, Ben, and that is in respect of, as the OEB proceeds to higher level performance, to becoming a top tier regulator, can you let me know what your view is of what role the regulated entity plays? Is it a partnership with the regulator to get to higher performance?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, because it is important that the companies also play ball and encourage on the journey. And I think there's a sort of there's a tactical and a strategic aspect to that. There's a sort of day-to-day tactical thing, which is behaving in the right way to the regulator. And there are a couple of no-nos here, like the CEO and the senior management come in and are very nice and friendly with the regulator, but at the staff level, they're obstructive, and difficult, and the relationships are not working. And regulators absolutely hate that when they're getting mixed messages, different bits around the organization. And one of the things that I say to people, if you're having a conversation with the regulator, don't make them regret it, right? Don't sort of, try to develop a relationship and then hear something and then try and use it against them. Or don't be difficult. If you call and you don't get them and you leave a message, when they see who's called, you don't want them to think, oh no, I've got to call that person back and talk to them, right? So try to have a positive relationship. And then I think, there's an important piece about kind of playing nicely and constructively on a day-to-day basis. But then there is also a strategic long-term thing about recognizing what the regulator is trying to do and trying to turn that into a win-win situation. What does the regulator want to do? It wants to deliver affordability, reliability, sustainability. Okay, well, how can I get ahead of the curve? How can I get out in front and try and position myself to deliver those outcomes? That way I'll get a smoother ride through the regulatory process and get back to focusing on the day job, focusing on the customer. So I think trying to engage constructively and assist the regulator is the right way for industry to engage.
Okay, thank you for that, Ben. I'm just taking a look here at some questions, and there's one here for Susanna. How do you drive towards being a top quartile regulator while you are also striving to make stakeholder satisfaction a priority? Can the two be in alignment? Susanna.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the question and for the views from the panelists. I think it's a great question. And I also think that we've heard the panelists speak a bit about that today. And some of what they said aligns with my own thinking. And that really is that, that being a top quartile regulator and having satisfied stakeholders is not a mutually exclusive prospect. And I think that we've heard that today in various ways from people. When we did our OEB stakeholder survey, we got a lot of feedback from stakeholders about the sorts of things that they're expecting from the OEB, efficiency, transparency, accountability, a whole bunch of other things. Those are the same characteristics of being a top quartile regulator. And so in some ways, there actually is really good alignment there. And I think a couple of the panelists have really nailed that. So the answer is yes, I think there can be alignment. And I think this is especially true when the regulator and the regulated focus on the customer. Our panelists talked about this today. We got to focus on the ratepayer. And ultimately, that's why we exist. And so I think that's really the nexus for this. So thanks for the question.
Okay, in a similar theme, here's another question, and I think I'm going to direct this one to you first, Colette. There has been a lot of emphasis, understandably and properly, on the focus being the interest of the customer. Can the panelists comment on the other side of the balance and the regulator's role in looking out for the interest of the regulated entity?
Indeed, I think that question was from Ian, as I read it in the chat. Thank you for that, because You have heard us speaking a lot about the customer. I hope you also heard me say, after my years of training as a regulator, that we also have to take into account the interests of the shareholder, i.e. the company. The companies, let's face it, they are not nonprofits. They have a board of directors to answer to. They have leadership and management that really are on the front lines making the decisions about how to best provide this critical service to customers. And quite frankly, they're closest to customers. It is also equally important to embrace as a top quartile regulator. It's not the regulator's job to supplant the decision-making of the utility. And I say we, even though I'm no longer a regulator, we cannot supplant our thinking for how they think. They are planning for long-term horizons. As Ben said, hopefully they've come into the regulator and talked a bit about what they want to do long-term. I've always appreciated that. Not any ex parte communication or any inappropriate matter about pending dockets or matters, but I've greatly enjoyed them kind of pulling the curtain back and helping me understand where they were headed, so that if it's in the public interest, if it serves consumers well, I could aid them on that journey. But it's critical for the regulator to keep in mind that their decisions impact credit metrics. It impacts a utility's ability to attract investment. It impacts the daily and weekly write-ups from analysts on Wall Street for us in the US and other places around the world of whether to buy or sell stock and trade. And so it's critical for the regulator to understand how powerful their words are, their decisions are to the bottom line of the utility. We want utilities to be strong. We want them to have great credit ratings to attract great investors. That's important for consumers. They borrow money more cheaply. They can serve more efficiently. That inures to cheaper costs on consumers' utility bills. So no one wants to hurt the utility, and that's important for the regulator to understand. I think to Ben's point too, you're not opposing each other. Sometimes there will be disagreement. We have to be respectful about that and agree to disagree and to be thoughtful about this work. I always encourage regulators to use their powers for good, and helping find what's important for consumers equally doesn't mean it's bad for the company, but it's critical to always keep the impacts of decisions that are made at the energy regulatory level, keep in mind how that impacts the utility that's actually carrying out the work.
Thank you, Colette. Another question here, I'm going to ask David if you could comment on this. And it is, I would like to hear the panelists' views on the relationship between the regulator and the government. And I think that goes to something that you were highlighting, David, when you spoke of independence.
Yeah. I think that it is critical that the regulator be perceived as not influenced, dictated to by the government of the day. And in that regard, the development of too cozy a relationship between the regulator and government becomes very problematic. And indeed, in some contexts, might well lead to judicial challenges to the outcome of particular proceedings. Having said that, however, it is also important to keep in mind that there needs to be good communication between the regulator and the government of the day in the form of regular meetings, in the terms of clear understandings about certain matters that do not impinge upon the decision-making independence of the regulator in a particular case. And it seems to me that one of the important things in all of this is that to the greatest extent possible, interrelationships between the government of the day and the regulator be transparent, be on the public record, and that do not involve inappropriate interference on the part of the government in the mandate of the regulator. And so one of the things that I've spoken about in the past is the need in this particular context for the development of appropriate protocols that will actually define the relationship in greater detail than just talking about the general principles would do. Working out of a protocol for relationships with the government, how conversations are to take place at what level and with what limitations.
Christine, if you don't mind me saying hear to everything
Sure.
David said. And if I could add one more attribute on this point to the what a top quartile regulator looks like and what are those key attributes. One that I say a little tongue in cheek is a core of steel. When you're appointed to this role, you have to make decisions with certainty, and you have to defend those in Canada with your provincial political authorities. For me, it was either before my governor, before the state legislature, or before Congress. FERC is an independent agency, and so I did not ever get a call from the White House about any matter at all, which is key. But you also have to appear back before Congress, either on the Senate side or the House side, to answer for your decision making. And it's critical that you undertake that role day to day without fear of, reprisal or threat or a difficult conversation, which is sure to come. You have to make it and unapologetically be able to go to these political forces and to speak about the role in the rulemaking or the decision making with confidence. And that's critical. That's a critical element of independence, as David mentioned. And it's critical in building certainty and trust among stakeholders. You can't move with the political winds that shift from time to time. The regulator has to be a constant that is focused on the law and policy rather than the politics of the day. So thank you, David, for that.
Thank you for that, both of you. I want to turn to another question, and it is for Susanna. You mentioned in your remarks that a stakeholder survey was recently undertaken by the OEB. How will the OEB be taking conclusions from the survey and turning them into action items?
Susanna. Thank you for the question. One of the aspects that we're really trying to do is to get feedback in a number of different ways. There's not just one track to receiving feedback from those we regulate, those we serve. And so we came with the idea of an Ipsos survey. So to our panelists, Ben and Colette, independent survey done by a third party in confidence to really ask some really important questions to all of the stakeholders we have. And we decided rather than doing separate surveys for each of the various stakeholder groups, that we would go with one survey. So it's not a perfect survey in many ways, but what came back from it was a very clear sense that there's work to be done inside the OEB. And so just like we did with our financial review, we are going through as a management team and as an OEB to actually do our management response to the themes of the surveys. We'll make those themes and our responses to them public, transparently, like we have done with our financial review. And our goal there really is to have a baseline, a benchmark for this first year that we've started. And we'll do the survey for the next 2 years. So it'll be 3 years running of the survey to really see if we're moving the needle in any way. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Ben, you've spoken a bit to this, as has Colette, but what can regulators learn from each other? Does having different mandates make it hard to draw comparisons, or are there lessons to be learned?
I think it'd be
Ben, do you want to start?
Sure. I think it'd be interesting to hear Colette's views on this as a former regulator in a variety of roles. I think absolutely there are things that regulators can learn from each other and observe in each other. And I've talked about some things from the UK and Australia. I think one observation that I found very interesting, in the UK, Ofgem sets the rules and then applies the rules. And I think the OEB is the same. In Australia, the AER does not set the rules. That's a different body called the AEMC. And I think there are different views on this, and some people think it's good process for those two bodies to be separate. But what I found is, if the regulator can't set the rules but simply applies them, it's maybe a bit harder for the regulator to really be a stakeholder in the sector, really drive change, identify issues like the energy transition, for example, which are going to have an impact on the framework. And it's harder to innovate, right, if you can't actually change the rules, if you're simply stuck with applying them. So I do think those different kind of constructs in different jurisdictions can have actually a quite fundamental impact on the flexibility of the regulator to operate. And therefore, actually, perhaps subconsciously, how the regulator thinks and how much the regulator thinks of itself as actually, in the bus with everybody else, trying to get to the same direction.
And I agree with, thank you, Christine. I agree with everything Ben said. And so we've been adding to this really robust list of attributes for the top quartile regulator. Another one I will put a pin in here is the imperative that in an effort to strive for continuous improvement and continuous learning, that the top quartile regulator is leaning in to his or her colleagues around the world. I mentioned at the top of our time together how much I greatly valued our relationship with the Canadian regulators and the Canadian energy regulatory community writ large. We've learned so much from each other. We've traded a few leaders, in fact, across the border from time to time. We've learned so much from our peers in bilaterals, in cooperatives, in roundtables around the world. And it's critical that the top quartile regulator be committed to that, and to be committed to being challenged in a very healthy way to do better. We have a saying in the South, I'm from Arkansas originally, as you know, when you know better, you do better. So sometimes a newness and freshness of perspective that Susanna now brings to the OEB is very healthy, because she will not be beholden and wedded to the way things have been done for a million years. She can come in with a freshness and a liberty to ask, why do we do this? Is this the best way to do it? And it's not to put anyone in defensive, it's to try to find greater efficiency in the work. Likewise, I couldn't agree with Ben more. Learning from our regulators around other jurisdictions, other countries, other locales has been very instrumental in my individual growth as a regulator. And I would also suggest in the ultimate improvement of processes and procedures at the regulatory agencies. If I could also add, one thing that I came to appreciate in nearly 10 years of being a regulator, it's really important for the regulator to get that education, but it's important for stakeholders to do it too. So for those who are in industry, those who are at a utility, even for us at our commission, when I arrived at the State Commission, very few staff members were allowed to go to conferences. I think that there was a thinking that it was a boondoggle or some kind of fun trip. We need a top quartile regulatory team to be on the cutting edge, just like the leaders are. They are leading too. And they are the ones that are making these suggestions. Sorry, you hear my doorbell. They are the ones that are making these suggestions to the decision makers and the policy makers. So it's critical also. So yes, the regulator needs to be trained, the staff needs to be trained, but finally bringing that expertise to the OEB. So the OEB utilizing its convening power, and we were speaking about collaboration and making sure all the boats are rising together. Bring that expertise and talent to you for the benefit of all of the stakeholders. And I think that that will be very helpful in moving along in the integration of greater efficiency in achieving the mandate that the sector has upon it in a more expeditious fashion.
Great comments, Colette. I just have one last question that I'm going to pose to each of the three of you. And it is in respect of, as Susanna leads the OEB toward top quartile performance, is there one piece of advice that you would give her? And I'm going to start with you, Ben, and then I'm going to move to Colette, and then I'm going to finish off with David. So your best piece of advice for Susanna as she moves forward.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I think the one piece of advice I'd give Susanna is be accessible. You know, be accessible. There's been a lot of talk, you mentioned it in your opening remarks, around the importance of relationships. Colette talked about always being willing to sit down, as long as it's not, you know, circumventing a process or inappropriate in some way. Absolutely sit down, understand the businesses that she's regulating, hear where they're trying to go, and, you know, does that make sense for the customer? So be accessible, have the confidence, which I'm sure you absolutely will, to feel that you can do that without compromising your independence. You're not going to bend in the wind, but having that relationship, being close, being accessible, is the piece of advice I would give.
I would say, to add on to Ben's list, be open. And so you've heard us talk a bit about that, Susanna, being open to what the end will look like. You don't hold that crystal ball, but it's through leveraging the many talents and strengths of your colleagues, the great team you have at the OEB, and critically important, the many stakeholders. These men and women have been doing this for decades. So don't be intimidated by that. Leverage it and allow them to inform this work, and you'll be better educated and have great buy-in in a collaborative spirit that will really buoy the effort for years to come.
And finally, David, over to you.
Susanna, I'm not sure what advice I'd give you, but I think maybe be nimble and proactive, aim to anticipate movements in government policy that affect the regulatory task, and also, and I think in some senses most importantly, keep on top of evolutions in the sector that you're regulating, so that you can, on a knowledge basis, engage in the task that you've been hired to do.
Great, all good advice. And I want to thank all those who put questions in the chat. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but hopefully we touched upon a few. And I want to give my personal thanks to the panel. You made my job very easy this morning. So thank you for all your insights. It was a pleasure.